And welcome to a lecture on Systems and Disease, Chapter 4, and pages 132 to 134 on a book version that maybe none of you have anymore, so, let's just follow along with what I say. Alright, so this chapter, the first part, Systems, is all about how body systems are organized, right? And when we talk about organization beyond the cellular level, one of the first stops is the tissue level. So a tissue is a group of cells that have one single function. These are specialized cells with a specific single function. Or a specific function. Not necessarily single, but a specific function. Right? So, the next level beyond tissues is when you have an organ. So an organ can be one or more tissues that are put together, and they have a specific function in the organism. Right? So you might have a very simple organ which basically has the same function as its tissues, or you might have an organ like the stomach which is made of multiple different types of tissues, right? The stomach has an epithelial lining on the inside to protect it from the acid. It has a muscular layer, right? It has multiple types of tissues, providing it multiple different functions that are specific for digestion. Right? So they have a specific function, and they are made out of one or more different tissue layers. So now that we know that organs are made out of one or more different tissue layers, let's talk about the different tissues out there. So this is our roadmap. We have connective tissues, muscular tissue, nervous tissue, and finally epithelial tissue. And we'll just start right off with connective tissues. Now, all connective tissues consist of the cellular components, and the cellular components are embedded move this around. They are embedded in a matrix. A matrix consists of a ground substance and various types of protein fibers. So ground substances is a general term. You can have fluidic ground substances, you can have ground substances that are jelly-like, and you can have solid ground substances. This is just sort of the stuff surrounding all those cells. It's surrounding the cells. Whereas with the protein fibers, these are specific different types of fibers, and depending on how many of what type you have, you change the properties of the connective tissue. Alright, so again, ground substance is the non-cellular portion of connective tissue, and it separates the cells. So instead of having like a layer of cells together, what you'd end up having are cells, and they're separated by whatever that ground substance might be. So, like I said, fluid, jelly-like, solid. And then let's talk about the different type of protein fibers we have. So, not only do we have the ground substance, we have protein fibers. And there are three basic classes. One is collagen. So collagen, seen here, right? This is a thick type of fiber. Collagen is thick. It is strong and flexible, and it resists pulling very well. It can resist forces pulling against it. It has a high tensile strength. So that's collagen. Very nice. And we can compare that to reticular fibers over here. So, reticular fibers, right here, they've got it in blue for high contrast, and this is what it actually looks like where you have the cells in the matrix, right? So you've got your cells separated out from each other, and then between the cells is the matrix, and in that matrix are these reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are thin, they're branched, and they're very mesh-like. So they're very thin, they're branched out, and they form meshes. Good for supporting. Not as strong as collagen, much lower tensile strength, but they can form that nice little branching mesh. So they can support structures. So collagen, strong and flexible, and resists pulling, whereas reticular, thin, branched, and it forms a fine mesh. So, good for supporting various types of structures. And then lastly, we have the elastic fibers. So elastic fibers are long, they are thin, they are a little weaker than collagen, but they are the most flexible. They are highly elastic. Obviously, given the name, elastic fibers. Okay, so now that we know that connective tissues are cells embedded in a matrix that consists of a ground substance and specific type of fibers, we can go into the different types of connective tissue we see in an organism, like the human. So, this is our roadmap. We have fibrous connective tissues, cartilage, bone, and one that you might not think of, blood. And we'll just start right off with fibrous connective tissues. So you see this sort of commonality in the naming of cells and connective tissue. When you see blasts, that's generally the cells that secrete the ground substance, secrete the matrix, essentially. So a fibroblast is a cell in fibrous connective tissue that secretes the ground substance and the protein fibers, right? So it secretes the fibers and it secretes the ground substance. And there are different types of fibrous connective tissue. So we'll start off with loose fibrous connective tissue. So with loose fibrous connective tissue, it supports various structures or organs, right? So you see a lot of reticular fibers in there and a lot of elastic fibers and not as much collagen. And it will create a nice little mesh for supporting structures. And because you have all those elastic fibers as well, right, all these elastic fibers, you get expansion. So it surrounds and protects structures by making a nice little mesh, and it also allows organs that can expand to expand. So it will help reduce friction during expansion as well. And here's some nice loose fibrous connective tissue forming that little mesh inside this surgically dissected ankle, right? So there's some muscle and tendon here. We can see a little bit of fat here. And we have all this mesh-like loose fibrous connective tissue in there. It's going to create this nice little layer that supports things, separates things, reduces friction when those muscles move, is just generally great for helping different organs work together, especially the ones that can expand and contract. Okay, so that's loose fibrous connective tissue, and we can compare it to dense fibrous connective tissue. Dense fibrous connective tissue is highly packed together, and it is primarily dense layers of collagen. So dense layers of collagen stacked together. And so that's what we're seeing in this image here, is layers and layers of collagen stacked close together. So all that massive amounts of collagen making up the matrix. And so the structures that you see dense fibrous connective tissue in are ones that have to withstand massive amounts of force, like your tendons. A tendon connects a muscle, like your gastrocnemius, your calf there, to a bone. So here's the bone, the calcaneus, your heel bone, and here's the Achilles tendon that is so much cartilage. Collagen. Collagen. So, a tendon is massively thick layers of collagen because that resists pulling forces quite well, which you need because you don't want the muscle to pull against the bone and just have the tendon expand and not move the bone. Those tendons are what allow your bones to actually move your muscles. Now, in addition to tendons, you have all these joints, and you need to stabilize joints. And so, you will have dense fibrous connective tissue that attaches bone to bone in order to stabilize joints, and bone-to-bone connections are ligaments, like this ligament down here at the bottom of the foot that connects the heel all the way up the front of the foot there. And that's the plantar fascia ligament, and it helps stabilize any moving joint. So you're going to have ligaments connecting bone to bone and tendons connecting muscle to bone, and they are composed of this dense fibrous connective tissue with massive amounts of collagen because it is thick, it is strong, it's flexible enough that it can move as the joints rearrange, because the joints move, and it is strong enough that it resists pulling forces so that it doesn't collapse or overextend. So, very good. Another type of connective tissue is specialized, is adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is loose connective tissue with a primary cell is the adipocyte. the adipose site. So, adipose, this is basically a fat cell. So if you see adipo or adipose, we're talking about fats. So an adipocyte is a fat cell. Your fat tissue is loose connective tissue with lots of adipocytes embedded in it. An adipocyte is a very small cell. As we see in this picture, if I wanted to outline it here, you have a nucleus, right? So this is the nucleus. And then the primary component of the cell is this extremely large storage vacuole that contains a fat droplet. So it basically stores fat for you. It has that characteristic yellow appearance in the tissues. It provides a lot of important functions. So it stores fat. It's very crowded together, unlike a lot of other types of connective tissue where the cells are relatively spread out and there's a lot of matrix between them. Adipocytes are relatively densely packed together with the matrix separating them, but not near as much as like with your dense connective tissue or whatever. Anyway, so crowded together fat cells storing their fat, providing a lot of important functions, right? So fat stores energy. Those fat droplets can be kicked right into generation of ATP in two different parts of that whole chemical pathway. Well, more than that, but we're being overly simplified. Anyway, so you can kick a lot of energy out of fat, so that's good. Fat also provides padding. So a lot of organs that need padding will have layers of fat around them. Underneath the skin will be generally layers of adipose tissue. Right? Anywhere you need some good padding. Not so much insulation in humans. We don't have fat that's thick enough. But in certain types of animals that have fat for insulation, it's dense layers of fat that provide that insulation. Not so much for us. Anyway, but we get that padding. We get that energy storage. There's actually a fair amount of fat surrounding the heart because the heart uses a lot of that fat for energy, and it's nice to have padding for the heart. And in addition to that, it supports other structures. For instance, breast tissue here, those mammary glands and the ducts that provide milk are all suspended and supported by fat tissue. And then here's that fat underneath the skin, on the bottom of the skin. So, fat serves a lot of important functions, and it is a specific type of loose connective tissue. All right, so that's the fibrous connective tissues, the loose fibrous connective tissue and dense fibrous connective tissue. And now let's move on to cartilage. All right, so cartilage is anytime you see the prefix chondr, chondra, that means we're talking about cartilage. So a chondrocyte is a cell in cartilage, right? It's the type of cell that secretes the matrix. So it's the chondrocyte that's secreting the matrix. And we can see in this beautiful picture of cartilage, right here is a little pit called lacunae, or lacunae is plural. Anyway, it's a little pit, and inside the pit is the chondrocyte. This specifically is the chondrocyte. So, cartilage is very thoroughly packed with collagen, right? So we have smooth cartilage in a lot of different places in our body. It's extremely smooth. It's great for reduction of friction. So where you see this very smooth cartilage, we'll often call it articular cartilage, or cartilage that covers the joints, right? So that joint cartilage helps reduce the friction so that it moves very smoothly. The bone isn't grinding against each other. Everything's nice. It reduces the friction involved in the movement of joints. So this right here is a picture of smooth cartilage. You do have cartilage that isn't as smooth. You have some cartilage that's more elastic, and it's right there, your outer ear, the pinna. So the pinna, or your external ear, that's cartilage. And then your bendy nose parts, that's also a cartilage, but there's more elastic fibers in that cartilage. So most of the cartilage in your body is this smooth articular cartilage. Now, all cartilage is avascular. A being the Latin for without, vascular referencing blood supply. So cartilage does not get a active blood supply. No active blood supply. And that means that these cells don't get a ton of nutrients, right? You can see there's no blood vessels in that image. So, as I said, smooth, reduce friction. The other important thing about cartilage is that it does not have a nerve supply either. And when I mess with my ear, it does not hurt. The skin has a nerve supply, so I can bend my ear and stretch the skin to the point that that hurts, but the cartilage itself has no nervous supply, so it doesn't hurt. One of the consequences of having no blood supply and no real nerve supply is that cartilage does not heal near as well as connective tissue that does have a blood and nerve supply. So this is why injuries to cartilage can often be permanent. This is why when a knee joint breaks down, you eventually need knee replacement, because there's no effective method of getting your cartilage to heal back up. There's just not enough blood or nerve supply. There's not a nerve supply to direct all the cells to start healing. And there's not a blood supply bathing them with the nutrients to start replicating a bunch of cells. So generally, once you hit the end of your bone growth, all the cartilage you got is what you got. And if it breaks down like the inside of the upper portion of my kneecap right now, you get grinding. So some good old-fashioned osteoarthritis. Alright, so cartilage types. Hyaline cartilage is that smooth, articular cartilage covering joints. Right? Hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage is that stuff making up your nose and your ear. And then there's a third type called fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is extremely dense cartilage. You only find it in a couple of spots. When people talk about the discs, like I slipped a disc or I have a damage to a disc in their back, they're actually talking about these fibrocartilage discs that are between the vertebra in your spine. So between each vertebra is a fibrocartilage disc, and that's there to prevent the bone from grinding against itself and wearing down. So those fibrocartilage discs, they're extremely strong, highly resistant to pressure, and really great. The other place you find them is when you look at the pelvis, right? The pelvis comes around the front. It kind of looks like there's two parts to it. And then right here at the center, there's a thick fibrocartilage connection between those two parts of the pelvis, holding it together. Near childbirth, actually, and during later stages of pregnancy, that fibrocartilage holding the front of the pelvis together actually softens up and allows the pelvis to separate out, because late stage pregnancy, the baby is very large, and during childbirth it has to pass through that pelvic floor, and that can be pretty rough. So the pelvis will actually separate during childbirth, which is pretty crazy. So extremely strong and resists force extremely well. Whether it's all that force from your spine and gravity keeping your vertebra from grinding, or the forces trying to separate your pelvis. So fibrocartilage is probably the strongest, least flexible cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the smoothest because it has to reduce friction in the joints. And then elastic cartilage is the most bendy. So, moving on, we have bone. So bone is another type of connective tissue. So just like with cartilage that had a solid matrix, bone has a solid matrix. The matrix of bone has collagen in it, right? Just like cartilage, but it also has these calcium crystals. If this were, A and P, you'd need to know the specific type of crystals, but this is Bio 1000, baby, so these are calcium crystals. So it's a matrix of collagen and crystals. Osteo is our prefix for bone, so osteocyte is our bone cell. The osteoblast is the bone cell that secretes the matrix. So if you look at this picture of bone right here in this faded part with a dark center, this is one of those little pits right there. There's a pit, and inside the pit is a osteocyte. So your bone, the compact parts of your bone actually make this cool ring structure. So you have rings, and forming each ring, we can see, where am I? Come here, little, there, okay. So if we look at a ring coming around, oh, that was a terrible picture. Anyway, you can see there are pits all along each ring. So as the bone expands, as the ring expands, you get multiple rings, kind of like a tree, as it expands outward. That's as you grow and the bone thickens, you're putting on more rings. At the center of a ring is a blood and nerve supply. So there is, at the center, blood supply. And then that blood branches out throughout there. And then you also have nerves passing through there as well. So, osteocytes secrete the matrix. Vascular, so it does have a blood supply. These are getting a lot of oxygen and nutrients. It is innervated, which means it has a nerve supply, right? And that means that bone actually heals pretty well, which is, generally a good thing. You want bone to heal. And it heals because it has that nice, complicated, complex blood and nerve supply. So we have mineralized from those calcium crystals. So those calcium salts, and then collagen. So the salts provide rigidity, and the collagen provides flexibility. Right? So if you have bone that has defective collagen, you have rigid bone, but it's very brittle. Whereas if you have bone that has defective minerals, the calcium salts aren't forming right, you have very flexible, soft bone. So you need them both to have a strong bone. Without the collagen, any impact to the side of a bone would snap it. It becomes extremely brittle without collagen. You need that collagen to give the bone the flexibility it needs. So, we can separate bone into two basic types. You have compact bone. Compact bone, by the name, has very dense layers of bone. When we talked about those rings right here, these rings surrounding a central canal where you have blood and nerves. By the way, that's called an osteon, one of those sets of tree rings surrounding the central canal. That's an osteon. And in compact bone, you have multiple osteons densely packed together, creating this very dense, strong bone. So, compact bone is awesome at resisting vertical forces. Compact bone is extremely strong bone. It resists vertical forces. It very efficiently supports the structures in the body. It's the thickest bone. It resists breakage the best. Like I said, there are rings surrounding a central canal, and that's all called an osteon. And we can contrast compact bone with spongy bone. Spongy bone is it's not dense. It has a lot of hollow spaces. So when you look at spongy bone, you have this like little spiky structure. Like little spikes and lots of space between the areas. So you get a lot of space in spongy bone. So you can do a lot with that space. For one, spongy bone, the name spongy right there says it. So it's great at absorbing impact. So it can absorb impact really well. Spongy bone absorbs vertical impact, right? Compact bone resists vertical forces, is very dense and strong and resists breakage, but spongy bone actually absorbs the impacts when bones move against bones. Like when you take a step, there's actually quite a lot of force moving through those bones, and the spongy bone is what absorbs the impact. So it's irregularly shaped, It doesn't have those nice rings. This picture has a little bit of spongy bone right here, showing how it changes drastically in structure. At the center of any long bone, you have spongy bone and a cavity, and that's where the bone marrow is. Now, bone marrow is where we find the tissue that produces blood cells. So, very important. And the spongy bone creates a nice protected area where you have that marrow. And so again, here's our compact bone, where we have those multiple osteons growing together, creating this very thick bone. And then over here, you can see the spongy bone at the head of a long bone. So if you look at a long bone in the body, like the femur, sure, you're going to have spongy bone anywhere you have to resist impacts. So at either ends of long bones, you're going to have spongy. And then along the sides, where you're going to need to resist the vertical forces the most, is where you have your compact bone. So, compact bone lines the sides of a long bone, and then at the center we have a layer of spongy bone surrounding the bone marrow. And speaking of how bone marrow makes blood cells, blood is our last type of connective tissue. Blood has a fluidic matrix. So, you know the name of the matrix of blood as plasma. Blood plasma is the liquid ground substance and the various fibers and other dissolved particles that are in blood. This is the fluid through which the cellular portion of blood travels. So plasma is the matrix, and blood delivers oxygen, right? It delivers nutrients, and it delivers signals. Right? Oxygen, nutrients, signals, whether they're local signals or for the most part, if it's coming through the blood and it's a hormone, a signal, it's a hormone. Blood delivers all those, and then it removes wastes. It removes various types of waste generated by organs or structures. And then in the blood we have the cellular portion, the formed elements. We call it, instead of saying cellular portion, we say formed elements, because I believe I mentioned it when we were talking about differentiation. But when you go to make platelets, you build a really big cell, and then the platelets are little broken off fragments of that original cell. So platelets aren't actually cellular, they're chunks that are traveling in the blood. So we say formed elements because they're not all genuine cells. Platelets are actually non-cellular material that are derived from cells, formed from cells. So, the most numerous formed element are the erythrocytes, site cell, erythro, referring to the color red. Those are the red blood cells. right? Then we have leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. And then thrombocytes. Thrombocytes are the platelets. So, the clotting structures. The clotting structures in blood. We use cyte because they're derived from a cell, but they are the clotting structures. And then there's various other things all throughout blood. We're not going to get deep into blood until later in the circulatory system, so that's enough for now. And that takes care of connective tissue. So now we're moving on to muscular tissue. So 25% done. The whole point of muscular tissue is that it allows movement. Muscular tissue is unique because it can contract and it can relax. When muscular tissue contracts, it becomes shorter and thicker. And when it relaxes, it becomes longer. And muscle is always attached to bones. Muscles are ultimately attached to tendons, which are attached to bones, which means what do muscles move specifically? They move your skeleton. I was about to spell it in the fanciful way. They move your skeleton. They move bones. And that is why muscles allow for movement. They move your bones. So they contract, in which they become shorter and thicker, right? If this is your bicep, right, here's your arm bone, right, and then here's your other arm bone, and here's your hand. Why not? Your biceps over here. It's connected up right around here. And then you got your bicep like that, right? And when the bicep gets all fat and short, it pulls on that tendon, because the tendon doesn't change in length, and it raises that bone up. So that's how you go to the gun show. So because it becomes a little bit fatter and thicker and shortens, it moves the bone. And then when it relaxes, right, this is contracted and this is relaxed. So, contraction and relaxation allows movement of the bones. There's a tendon connected over to the whatever. So, muscular tissue is built out of muscle fibers. Muscle fiber is the fancy name for a muscle cell. Muscle cells are extremely long cells, often drawn as nice little cylinders. Right? Very, very long cells. And they have protein fibers inside them. So if you see, we'll talk about this during the lecture, but a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. Inside the muscle cell are these filaments, these protein filaments. And it's the protein filaments that we'll talk about in the next lecture that allow relaxation and contraction. There would allow the muscle cell to change in length and width. There are different types of muscular tissue. We have skeletal muscular tissue, which is responsible for moving your bones. It is voluntary. You choose to move your skeletal muscles. Then you have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle lines hollow organs. Right? It lines hollow organs. So like your digestive tract, you have smooth muscle along your esophagus, you have smooth muscle around your stomach, your intestines are lined by smooth muscle. Anything that's hollow, that's an organ, has smooth muscle lining it. There's smooth muscle layers lining your blood vessels. Those are hollow organs. So, smooth muscle is not voluntary. It is involuntary. It does not contract as nicely as skeletal muscle. And then lastly, you've got cardiac muscle, and you can probably guess what structure cardiac muscle is associated with. It's the heart. So skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is, as I said earlier, voluntary. You choose to move it. It is striated. It has a striped appearance. So in this picture, we can see these stripes. These stripes are indicative of the fact that it can do an awful lot of contraction. These muscle fibers can contract significant amounts. So, these are really good at contraction. And they allow you to move your bones. Then we have smooth muscle. It is, like I said, not under control. You do not voluntarily control it. Right? Otherwise, you'd have to be like, I'm going to start swallowing. I will continue swallowing. I'm going to swallow all the way to my stomach. Right? Because when you have voluntary control, you're controlling just how much you move a muscle and just how far and everything. Right? So involuntary is important for smooth muscle. You don't want to have to think about doing all the things associated with your digestive tract and your blood vessels. The muscle fibers are spindly. So if you look at them, they're kind of spindly like that. Big old nucleus. They got the picture here, but I like drawing. Anyway, they can contract and relax because they're muscle, but they don't contract and relax near as much as skeletal muscle. And as I said, they surround hollow organs, like everything in your digestive tract, all the organs of your digestive tract, as well as your blood vessels. Right? There are layers of smooth muscle in those organs or structures. Their whole job is to affect the length of the hollow organ. In the digestive tract, they actually push things through, right? When you have food in your esophagus, contraction and relaxation pushes things down. Right? So the muscle contracts above whatever you're trying to swallow, and it sort of shortens the esophagus, right? There's actually smooth muscle layers around the width and around the length. So when that smooth muscle contracts, the esophagus becomes thinner and shorter, and it exerts a downward pressure on that, and at the same time beneath the food it's relaxing, so things get pushed through. So your esophagus does that. Makes sense. And every single organ along the way does that. That kind of pushing is called peristalsis. Awesome word. Peristalsis is the smooth muscle contraction and relaxation ahead of, and relaxation, whatever. Getting no sleep and starting to mess with my whole brain. Right? So contraction above, relaxation below, and however you want to term that when you're in your intestines and going horizontal. At any rate, it's all peristalsis. Kind of like how earthworms move. Then lastly, we have cardiac muscle. Now you'll notice cardiac muscle has those striations, right? Indicating that it can do a lot of contraction, which makes sense. The more striations you have, the more drastic and powerful your contractions can be. So it's kind of hard to tell the difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle because they're both striated, but the big thing going on here is, one, cardiac muscle has these branchings, so it's going to be branched. And the other big thing here is the fact that around these bundles we can see these plates. So cardiac muscle obviously in the heart, derp. Again, involuntary. You don't want to have to mentally control your heartbeat. You don't have to be like, okay, move the blood, move the blood, move the blood. Hey, a bird, I'm dead. Striated, indicating the high degree of contraction that can occur. And then you have these discs, these intercalated discs that separate out the muscle cells. So anywhere you have muscle cells end to end, there's an intercalated disc between them. It allows nutrients and signals to pass between the muscle cells very easily. So nutrients like oxygen and also signals pass between the cells through that intercalated disc very rapidly. And that's because your heart needs to contract sort of all as one. And we'll talk about that a lot in the cardiovascular system lecture. So, but the big thing when trying to figure out if it's skeletal or cardiac, aside from branching, the really big thing is there an intercalated disc? If there is an intercalated disc, then you have cardiac muscle. You don't need to try and identify anything else. If you're just looking at a picture, intercalated disc, cardiac. All right, and on to nervous tissue. So, nervous tissue. The cell of nervous tissue is the neuron. This is the nerve cell. Right? It consists of 3 distinct regions. The dendrite is this tree-like branching portion of the cell. The tree-like branching portion of the cell. And you can see there's lots and lots of branches. So the dendrites are very complex branching structures. So if you know anything about, plants and trees, dendra is a prefix used when talking about trees. So because it has that tree branch-like appearance, they called it the dendrites. Anyway, so branching, tree-like branching. The cell body is where you find the nucleus and various other organelles. Right? So the mostly drawn is round portion. And then we have the axon. It's sort of like a tail. Nerve cells don't always have one axon, but when you're drawing it, you can feel free to be as lazy as you want. And the axon is the long tail coming off of the cell body. So, then the axon will often have some branches at the end. And the axon connects to dendrites. It can also, in some specific cells, like motor neurons, the axon connects to the muscle. Right? So axon to muscle. And then with sensory cells, right? The sensor, whatever it might be, the specialized cell that senses whatever, connects to the dendrites. So, and then to the cell body, and then to the axon, and then to nerves. So, anyway, nervous tissue is really cool. Neurons is the term for the cells in the central nervous system. CNS is the central nervous system. And that is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we refer to nervous tissue as nerves in the peripheral. Peripheral nervous system. Nerves are extremely large. So what you have is bundles of very long axons. So the peripheral nervous system is where you find sensory cells connected to dendrites, which then it's kind of a cool pathway. The dendrites then send their signal to the axons. The axons are very long, and they eventually connect up to the spinal cord. The spinal cord takes the information from those sensory cells and sends it to the brain, where it's processed. The brain then sends the response down the spinal cord, where it connects up to dendrites of neurons or nerves that will take the response information to the muscles. So it's kind of a cool thing. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get into the nervous system. But it's all about signals. Whether you're processing signals from sensory information, whether it's signals internally being processed within the brain, whether you're sending signals to your muscles to control them, the nervous tissue is all about sending signals and processing information. Now, in addition to these neurons, we have what are called the neuroglia. These are sort of accessory cells, and they serve various important functions in nervous tissue, but they are not sending and receiving signals and processing signal information. That is not what neuroglia do. So, here is a type of neuroglia, astrocytes, you don't got to remember that, oligodendrocyte. These are all glial cells, and they serve different important functions. So, don't need to go into all those functions. Anyway, here's a nice picture of the connection between an axon and a dendrite, and where they connect, we call that a synapse. When a dendrite and an axon connect, we call it a synapse. It's actually not a physical connection. If this is the end of an axon, right, it will connect up to a dendrite, and it'll kind of be like this. This is my dendrite, and this here, this is my synapse. The connection between them, it's a space, and you actually have to send little chemical messengers across the space in order to determine what the response will be. So, anyway, that's the synapse. So a signal comes down the axon, and then maybe these little messages say continue the signal, and then the signal starts at the dendrite, and then continues along the cell body and down the axon, and then maybe it connects up to another one and says continue the signal, and we keep going. So, in the central nervous system especially, neurons are densely packed and highly interconnected. This is a very, very small section in which each different color is a different cell body and axon, and they are so densely packed and connected together that it's impossible to really count. And here's an artist's sort of depiction of what you might see if you could look at the neurons in the brain, this dense, branching, interconnected system. And then we can compare the central nervous system to the nerves in the body. So these large nerves that control muscle movement, like the sciatica, they will have dendrites up at the spinal cord, and then you'll have multiple cells with their dendrites connecting up to the spinal cord, and then you have the axons, and the axons are all bundled together, and you get just a ton of axons bundled together, and that's what nerves are. Nerves are a large number of axons all bundled together. And this is just a little picture of some accessory cells. So they serve multiple functions. Here is an accessory cell that's creating a nice layer around blood vessels so that anything from the blood has to pass through the accessory cell before going to the neuron, so that you have this protective layer. So not anything in the blood can get directly to the neuron. Helps filter out various toxins and various toxic concentrations of stuff. Also does an efficient job of preventing a lot of drugs from affecting your brain. At any rate, the blood-brain barrier, if you've ever heard the term, that's created by these little cells that surround, glial cells that surround blood vessels. And then you've got little glial cells that make little fat pads around axons that when we talk about the nervous system, accelerate electrical impulses for communication. So lots of different functions. Okay, so ultimately, communication. We send signals, right? We receive signals, and we process signals. It's all about information and signals. That's what the nervous tissue does. Send, receive, process. Take in information, process information, respond to information. So, sensation, that's cells that specialize in certain types of detection of information, and then connect up to a neuron that sends that information to the spinal cord, to the brain, right? So sensation is nervous tissue. And, of course, ultimately, you need nervous control for your voluntary muscles. Anyway, moving along to the fourth and final type of tissue, the epithelial tissue. So, epithelial tissue is what makes up the outer coverings, the interface with the external environment. Whee, that got real crazy. Oh, okay, stop it. So it interfaces with the external environment, right? That's one of the functions of epithelial tissue. All the coverings of your body are epithelial tissue. They also line body cavities right? So your big central body cavity where all your organs, your viscera are, have epithelial linings that secrete fluid to keep friction down. So they line your body cavities. They can be very simple, and you have different types of organization for those epithelial tissues. For example, skin cells are what we call stratified tissue, epithelial tissue, which means you have multiple layers. And those layers of cells, right, you have some layers of cells, and they're ultimately connected to a basement membrane and that's what connects the epithelial tissue to other tissue types. So we have our layers and our basement connecting it to other tissue types. Put in some weird shaped cells because at the top it's all weird compressed flattened cells. Anyway, there are some various different types of cell shapes when it comes to epithelial tissue. Squamous epithelial cells are flattened cells that are irregular in shape. They have no specific regular shape. Flattened, right? So the outer layers of your skin are great examples of squamous epithelial cells. Then you have cuboidal cells, which are amazingly enough roughly cube shaped, right? So they appear to be roughly shaped like a cube right there. You find these in the glands. An awful lot of cuboidal cells can be found in the glands. And then you have columnar cells. Columnar cells are cells that are amazingly enough elongated, right? Like columns. And they line a lot of different structures in the body. So a lot of hollow organs have epithelial linings around the hollow space. For instance, here we have an oviduct, and if you look in close on it, you can see these columnar epithelial cells with cilia on them, and those cilia help move the fluid in the oviduct so that the egg cell can move. Right? So you have these columnar cells lining that hollow structure. Any shape of epithelial cell can be simple, where it's no layers, or stratified, where there's layers. So you can have stratified squamous epithelium. Right here is our stratified layers of squamous epithelial tissue. And then here is the basement. Right, so this is a great depiction of skin. Over here, lining a gland, you might have layers. And with columnar, it's actually very rare to see actually stratified columnar. It's all pseudo-stratified. Yeah, pseudo-stratified. In other words, they're not strictly one on top of the other. They're sort of pressed up against each other, but it's not one distinct layer. Right? So we call it pseudo-stratified. There's different levels, but they're not stacked on each other like you see with the other stratified cells. So, there we go. And that's tissues. So now it's on to a little bit about pathology. So pathology is all about disease. Disease is a catch-all for when homeostasis stops working. Stop it. Give me that back. Homeostasis breaks down. In other words, disease characterizes a set of common signs and symptoms that are a part of disrupting homeostasis. So, a sign, by the way, is something that is objective, something that can be measured, right? If you have a fever of 103 because you're hot-blooded, that is a sign, right? If your skin is yellowing, that's a sign. That's objectively observable, measurable, right? Whereas a symptom is subjective. In other words, it is felt, right? So, malaise, where you feel bad. Exhaustion, right? Soreness. These are things that are felt, but your doctor can't look at you, stick a thermometer in you, or attach something to you and get a number directly related to how bad you feel, how exhausted you are, how sore you are. These are subjective. So signs are objective, symptoms are subjective. All right? When we talk about diseases, we will often talk about whether a disease is acute, chronic, or both. An acute disease is, or the acute phase of a disease, is where you have a sudden onset and a short duration, right? So the disease comes on suddenly and it's relatively short in duration. Famous, it would be the 24-hour flu, right? It comes on pretty fast. You have a very bad day of vomiting and diarrhea, and then it goes away relatively fast. It tends to be very severe, but relatively short in duration. Whereas a chronic illness has a gradual onset of symptoms and signs, and it can be just as severe. Sometimes it's not quite as severe, but the big thing is that a chronic disease repeats, right? You have a gradual onset, they peak, they tend to go down, and then a chronic disease repeats itself. The onset comes back. So, you don't get the 24-hour flu and then have it go away and then immediately get it back and go, that's an acute disorder. Whereas a chronic disease might be something like herpes, where the cold sores arrive and then they eventually dissipate and go away, and then again the cold sores come back. So that's a chronic disease. Infection has a very specific definition, and it regards microbes. So microbes are microscopic organisms. Most people think bacteria, but there are lots of them, right? There's protists, there's fungus, there's bacteria, there's viruses, microscopic organisms, and they are proliferating where they are not supposed to be. They are proliferating where they're not supposed to be. I always like to take a time to mention the normal flora of an organism. The normal flora is the natural microbes that live in and on you. Right? Current estimates show that there's roughly an equivalent number of microbes that live in and on you as there are cells that make you. So you're really more of an ecological community, like you're really more of an ecosystem than you are an individual organism. You have lots of bacteria and various other things in your gut. There's yeasts that live on your skin and bacteria that live on your skin and in your nose and everywhere. Those are your normal flora. For the most part, they are either harmless or they are beneficial. For instance, the bacteria in your gut, the E. coli, that live in your gut, they sort of hang out, layering themselves along your intestines, and they kind of make their own happy population. And if you've got a large, healthy population of E. coli in your gut, if something that's disease-causing, like Clostridium difficile, which is a bacterium that can colonize your gut, if Clostridium difficile comes along, it can basically not find any place to stay. If you have a nice healthy population of E. coli, Clostridium difficile rolls up, there's no place to stay. And it's much harder to get a clostridial infection of your intestines. So, very good. E. coli, the gut bacteria, also seem to play roles in making neurotransmitters and various other, it's very fascinating stuff, the normal flora. Very cool to look into. So, because the normal flora are harmless and even beneficial, getting antibacterial everything is bad. Don't try and destroy all the bacteria on you. Don't use antibacterial soaps in the shower, because skin bacteria can secrete antibacterial stuff because they don't want competition to ward off pathogens, disease-causing microbes. And they can, again, take up space so pathogens find no room at the inn, all that stuff. So, use hand soap, but don't buy antibacterial hand soap. You're probably not using it right anyway. You have to soap up your hands for 20 seconds, ABCs through Next Time Won't You Sing With Me or Happy Birthday Twice, to properly use soap, including antibacterial soap. And they are equal in effectiveness if you do it for 20 seconds. And if you don't do it for 20 seconds, they're generally equal in ineffectiveness, which means you're paying extra for something that doesn't really do anything for you. Okay, so I'm going to have to break here and come back because I have to go to traffic school to mitigate a ticket. Come on, stop. I said stop. Alright, so just a brief review real quick. We were talking about infection, and when we talk about infections, that is a proliferation of microbes in the body where they shouldn't be. So they are located where they shouldn't be. Right? And we can contrast this with the normal flora, which are the microbial population that are a natural part of your body. I've mentioned this, like, for you it will be literally seconds ago, but for me it was hours upon hours ago, so I'm just reviewing it again. So, it is a natural part of your body's ecosystem. Right? Because there's about as many microbial cells that are a natural part of your ecosystem as there are cells that make you up. And these are things like your gut bacteria, the bacteria that live on your skin, so bacteria that colonize almost everywhere in you. Like there's bacteria, there's fungus, like yeasts, there are fungus, and there's even viruses that make up the normal flora. And as I've said before, normal flora in general is harmless at worst, and at best beneficial or even vital to the healthy functioning of the organism. So, indeed, your normal flora could be vitally important to you. It seems like some of your gut bacteria are involved in the production of neurotransmitters like dopamine. So it could be very well that a healthy normal flora is important to mental health even. So pretty amazing stuff. It's really forefront research to be looking into the normal flora. Anyway, so my big caveat here is that do not use antibacterial products for everything. Like a big thing a few years ago was that Oust air sterilizing spray that was supposed to kill 99.9% of bacteria in the air. That's nuts. That's overkill. That's wasting money. You're throwing money away. One, like, it's not killing bacteria in the air. I mean, they're traveling. You're not going to, like, hit the air and that's all the air that's ever going to be in your room. That's dumb. And, like, antibacterial body washes are in general a bad idea. Antibacterial hand soaps, in general, a bad idea. even antibacterial dish soaps in general are a bad idea. Honestly, you don't even need antibacterial cleansers for counters or something like that, as long as you clean thoroughly with something like Windex or other surface cleaners. You don't need antibacterial stuff. Antibiotics that they put in that antibacterial stuff can be overused. And that's very bad. And we'll talk briefly in this lecture about why it's very bad. So let's talk about some of the basic features of bacteria. When we talk about pathogens that cause disease, that disrupt homeostasis, the one most people think about would be bacteria. Right? So there's some important features of bacteria. One, they have a rigid cell wall surrounding the cell. It is made of something unlike any of the cell walls in eukaryotic life. It's actually, you don't need to know this, but it's actually called a peptidoglycan cell wall. Peptidoglycan being the main component of that cell wall, and that is not anything that exists in eukaryotic life. In fact, there are a lot of antibiotics that target the cell wall or the mechanisms involved in producing the cell wall. So you have that peptidoglycan cell wall creating a nice, strong protective layer. So then you have, if bacteria have any kind of movement capability, it's through flagella. Bacteria do not have cilia. So that is a eukaryotic thing. Cilia are not present in bacteria. One of the unique things for bacteria, we talked about way back when, is the plasmid. Right? So if you look inside a bacterial organism, its plasmid, like its genome, is circular. That's where you find all the primary genes important for keeping the organism alive. There's the circular genome. And then in addition to that, you have plasmids, which are extra genomic DNA. They're non-genomic DNA, and it is accessory DNA. And on there you'll find often genes that produce toxicity, like toxicity genes, things that produce toxins, poisons. You can also find resistance genes on the plasmids. So resistance as in antibiotic resistance. What's cool about plasmids is that they can be traded. So not only do they contain novel new genes that aren't necessarily a part of the bacterial chromosome, they can be transferred. So you can find genes for resistance, genes for toxin production. They can be transferred between bacteria. If one bacteria has the genes to produce a little bridge, like this, and another bacteria has the genes to receive the little bridge, they can then copy off each other's plasmid information. So they can copy each other's plasmids and thus transfer information, trade genetic information, which is one of the ways bacteria are champions at evolutionary adaptation, because they can trade genetic information so easily, and they can trade it between unrelated strains of bacteria. As long as one has the genes for making the bridge and one has the genes for receiving the bridge, They absolutely do not have to be the same strain of bacteria. They can be very different cells and still copy each other's plasmid information, which is pretty cool and terrible. All right. So when we talk about how bacteria causes disease, that's primarily through toxins, right? Chemicals that cause damage to your ability to maintain homeostasis, right? So there are two different ways a bacteria can subject you to toxins. One, they can produce the toxins inside the bacteria and then secrete them into your body. So they make the toxins and secrete them out of the bacteria. So if they're being secreted out of the bacteria, out or outside would be exo. So these are exotoxins produced inside the bacteria and then secreted out into the organism. So exotoxins can be pretty rough, but when it comes to treating diseases caused by exotoxins, there are some good things, and that's that once you kill the pathogen, once you kill the bacteria producing that exotoxin, murder, kill, you stop exotoxin production. No new toxins will be produced, and as soon as the ones that are currently you're exposed to are metabolized, you're done. So exotoxins, very dangerous, but once you kill the bacteria making it, you stop exposure to the exotoxins. In contrast, we have endotoxins, right? So endo being inside. In this case, it's a little less intuitive. What we mean by an endotoxin is that the cell wall itself is pathogenic. It's toxic. So here's your cell wall, and it's got pathogenic lipopolysaccharides, or LPS. Anyway, you don't need to know lipopolysaccharide or LPS, but basically the components of the cell wall itself are the toxins, right? So as long as there is cell wall or even fragments of the cell wall present, then you are being exposed to the toxins, such that if you kill this bacteria, right? If the bacteria is killed by antibiotics, you still have the fragments of that cell wall in the system. And as long as the fragments of the cell wall are in the system, even if the cell is dead, even if the cell is dead, the toxin remains, right? That cell wall has to be completely broken down in order to remove that toxin. So when the bacteria die and the cell wall breaks apart, you still have exposure to the toxin. Whereas with exotoxins, when the bacteria dies, there's no more exotoxins being made. So endotoxins are a little rougher. Endotoxins are, one of my favorite words, pyrogenic, right? Pyro, you think fire. Well, fever causing. Whoa, hey, come back here. these things cause fevers. So basically, they are activating the immune system to sort of overreact to the presence of the endotoxin. And so the fever is your own immune reaction sort of getting a little bit turbocharged, and it is dangerous to you. So fever being a normal bodily function, if these organisms, a lot of these pathogens can only survive within a specific temperature range. And so if you raise it above their range, they can die. Well, these pyrogenic endotoxins cause your fever to go up to dangerous levels. So, not great. Where did he go? Ugh. My gecko has gone on walkabout. I will.
Stop.
Gecko. Come here. Where are you going? Crazy little bugger. All right. So, sort of tangent to this whole thing is something that's really cool called the cytokine storm. Speaking of activating the body's own immune system, some toxins will completely overactivate your white blood cells. So whereas pyrogenic is overactivating your inflammation response, your white blood cells release something called cytokines, which are signaling particles that basically identify where infections are, where microbes are, and help the body combat the microbes. There's a variety of different types of cytokines. This is Bio 1000, so we're gonna leave it there at this borderline terrible statement. Anyway, blah. Cytokines are a natural part of your immune system, helping you to combat pathogens. But there are some toxins that completely overactivate your white blood cells. Something like 0.01% to 0.1% of your white blood cells get activated in response to an infection. And there are some toxins that can activate like 10% of your white blood cells. And so when that happens, they all do their I'm going to be helpful and release cytokines thing, but there's so many released that it causes what we call a cytokine storm, and just the amount of cytokines in your body starts to cause severe damage. So famous cytokine storms would be toxic shock syndrome. If you've ever heard of it, toxic shock syndrome is a terrible result of an infection, right? So if you get a persistent infection producing these what we call super antigens, whatever those toxins are that overactivate the immune system, you get this infection of microbes producing super antigens, and you get that cytokine storm, and it can cause severe damage. Toxic shock syndrome, most famously associated with tampons that are left in too long. So tampons have an absorbent cotton or synthetic fiber construction, and they are really great at absorbing your menses, but at the same time they make awesome bacterial homes, which is, why you're supposed to take them out. And if left in, they can actually result in a severe infection that produces superantigens. So in like the 70s or 80s, this company came out with their 24-hour tampon. And it had very, very specific, or maybe it was a 12-hour. Anyway, they had this overnight tampon, and it had very, very specific instructions that like nobody followed because it was like an overnight tampon. So you just leave it in. And anyway, it resulted in a large number of these infections and toxic shock syndrome, TSS, and people died from TSS. And to this day, you can find warnings about toxic shock syndrome on your containers. So that's kind of cool. Tangent over. We're moving on to viruses. So viruses are an extremely common pathogen. They are the smallest, we'll put living in quotes because it is debatable, but smallest living organisms. I'm on the viruses are probably alive side of this thing, but there's plenty of respectable people on the viruses probably aren't alive side of thing, and then a lot of people on the maybe side of things. Anyway, smallest living organisms. Viruses are awesome. They consist of a little protein coat, or protein coat or shell, which is what's visible here. All this visible stuff in this electron micrograph is the protein coat or protein shell. That's all just protein. Right? And then inside the protein coat are enzymes to help chemical reactions occur, and the viral genome. Viral genomes are wacky, right? First of all, you can have viral genomes that are DNA, right? Classic double-stranded, double helix DNA. But you can also find viral genomes that are single-stranded DNA, which is pretty wacky. That is like single-stranded DNA exists nowhere else but viruses. And then just to make things even wackier with viruses, they can have genomes made of RNA, which again, you'd expect the single-stranded RNA, but in fact there are viruses with double-stranded RNA genomes. Viruses are pretty wacky. And that's awesome. So anyway, they have some enzymes and their genome inside the shell. And basically, each virus infects a very specific type of host cell. They infect a specific type of host cell. Right? A virus associated with respiratory infections attacks cells of the respiratory system. It does not attack your stomach cells or your esophagus or anything else. If it's specific to the respiratory system, it can only attack those respiratory cells. And so basically a virus infects its specific type of cell. It releases its enzymes and genome, and then it converts the infected cell into a virus factory. And so that cell then just becomes a factory for making new viruses, and eventually enough viruses are produced and the viruses rupture out from the cell, and go to infect new cells. So they rupture out and infect new cells. And that's how a viral infection do. Pretty cool. So they invade the cells, convert them into a virus factory, rupture out of the cells, and infect new cells, continuing this cycle until your immune system gets it under control, or you'd potentially die. So, pretty effective system. Viruses are champions at mutation. They have a very mutation-prone system. When they copy their genome, right, it is mutation-prone. They have a much higher mutation rate than any other gene copying or any other gene copying mechanisms in the living world. So all those mutations help viruses adapt because they constantly have to adapt to the immune system, because the immune system is all about recognizing and destroying viruses. So it's this constant arms race. It's pretty cool. So this is some terrible text resolution, but we have our virus here, right? And this is the cell to which it is specific. It attaches to the cell, right? This is its genome here, and it releases its genome into the cell. And inside the cell, the little enzymes and genome set it up to be a virus manufacturer, and it replicates the genome and it replicates the virus parts, and eventually it produces enough that it assembles all these new viruses, and they rupture out of the cell, off to go do the whole thing over again. All right, now let's move on into scary stuff. I love talking about the real scary stuff. So, prions. Prions are the keep you awake at night scary things. So, I think I've actually talked about this before in class because, well, I can't not mention prions. They scare me. Prions, right? So, what is a prion? So, first off, we have to talk about prion protein. So prion protein is a name given to a normal, functional protein in the body, right? So there's a gene for human prion protein, and that human prion protein gene codes for a normal, functional protein. And that does its specific job. I don't remember offhand what the specific function of human prion protein is, but you have a normal prion protein in your body. But for some people, they will have a defect in the human prion protein gene that causes the protein produced by that gene to be misfolded, and misfolded in just the wrong way. And once it does that, it becomes an infectious prion. Right? It is no longer normal. It is no longer functional. It is an infectious prion. And what that means is any time it comes into contact, physical contact with any prion protein, normal, causes the prion protein to convert into a prion, an infectious prion. So physical contact with a normal prion protein when your infectious prion protein comes into physical contact with a normal prion protein, the normal protein misfolds into an infectious prion. Just automatically. Something about that contact with an infectious prion causes it to misfold into an infectious prion protein. And then that can come into contact with normal prion protein and cause it to misfold into infectious prion protein. And this continues and this continues. And these proteins eventually build up and they start to block small capillaries in the brain. So they build up in the brain, blocking those very, very small brain capillaries and starting to kill brain tissue. So it starts to, anywhere you have a buildup of these proteins, you get the death of brain tissue. And you can see in slides of people who have prion diseases, these holes, these openings where there is dead brain tissue, because prions built up into enough concentration as to starve the surrounding brain tissue. And so the more prions misfolding in your body, the more they build up in the brain, the more brain tissue dies, the less your brain works, eventually causing death, right? It literally Swiss cheeses your brain and you will die. When you get one infectious prion in your bloodstream, you are now going to die. An infectious prion, a single infectious prion, will result in a 100% lethal condition. You are most likely to get a prion disease from consuming brains infected with prions or having the mutation in your prion protein, right? So CJD is the classic human prion disorder, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I'm probably going to spell Creutzfeldt wrong, but Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease. Now, if you want to know, sort of a layman, what it's like, it's basically mad cow disease. In fact, with the few instances where people ate tainted prion meat that had cow prions in it, they got cow-induced Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's mad cow. Kuru is a classic disease seen most often in peoples whose funeral rites involve ritual cannibalism, like consuming the dead out of respect for the dead or something like that. They'll consume the brain, and if there's prions in the brain, then they get the prion infection, Kuru. So one of the big symptoms of prion infections is shaking. As you kill brain tissue, you lose voluntary control of the body. Scrapie here. This last slide of brain tissue is scrapie. That's a sheep prion disease. As the prions build up in the sheep brain and Swiss cheese it, the sheep start to sort of lean up against fences and scrape their bodies against it, scraping off fur and skin. So, scrapies. Interestingly enough, there's never been a recorded case of transfer of prions from sheep to humans, but there are recorded cases of transfer of prions from cows to humans. So it's kind of fascinating. But anyway, 100% lethal, man. That is some scary stuff. I officially write in the notes that prions are scary. There's no way to make prion-tainted meat safe for consumption. Literally no way. Prions are incredibly resistant to pretty much anything we throw at them. The only way to stop a prion from being infectious is basically to incinerate it, which is, why there's no cure for you, because we don't do well when incinerated. All right, parasites. Let's get into eukaryotes. So, microbes can indeed be eukaryotes. In general, eukaryotic microbes that cause disease are considered parasites, right? And there's a ton of them. Right over here, we have the little malarial organism. So these little yellow circles, spheres, things are the infectious form of malaria in red blood cells. And they actually have a life cycle kind of similar to viruses. They don't convert the red blood cell into a malaria factory, but they do infect, they do enter a red blood cell and then use the nutrients of the red blood cell to replicate themselves. And when they get enough, they rupture out of the red blood cell and then go infect other red blood cells. So the malarial parasite kills your red blood cells. So not good for you to have your red blood cells die. Scabies is an example of a little arthropod related to ticks and mites. Right? So the scabies organism it burrows into the top layers of your skin and feeds on the keratin and the connective tissue of your skin, right? So it feeds on the skin, and you get these inflammations anywhere where the scabies are buried under your skin. So you get a bunch of inflammation where the scabies is. Not a good time. So malaria infecting red blood cells. Malaria is a mosquito-borne disease. What that means is this malaria infection is hitting this person very bad, and say a mosquito comes along and says, ooh, I'm going to stick my proboscis into their bloodstream and drink some blood. Well, they'll pick up malaria. And malaria will actually get into the mosquito gut, and it develops inside the mosquito gut, and then it migrates to the mosquito salivary glands, so that the next time the mosquito drinks blood, the mosquito exudes saliva when it first pops into your veins, your vessels, and then the malaria comes out. So it's mosquito-borne. It travels from person to person via mosquitoes. You cannot catch malaria from someone coughing on you. It's mosquito-borne. So it invades red blood cells, replicates inside them, and then destroys them when it leaves them to go infect other red blood cells. Then we have scabies, skin mites. They burrow into your skin and feed on the keratin and the connective tissue of your epithelium. So there are some neat methods of pathogen transmission. So we'll talk about a few examples, right? So airborne pathogen transmission, right? So what does it mean to be airborne? Well, there's two components to airborne transmission. One, you have droplets, right? This is what comes from the infected person, like bits of snot droplets or saliva droplets or respiratory juice, right? Some kind of liquid droplet containing the viruses. And in airborne transmission, what happens is you have these bits of dust, and the droplets are small enough to be carried on dust. So droplets on airborne dust. That's what it means to be airborne. So varicella is an example of a virus that does airborne transmission. Then you have direct contact transmission. So this is when you have to have direct contact with infected fluids. So again, snot, saliva, blood is a big one, right? Respiratory juices. You have to come into direct contact with their fluids, right? So they have to sneeze on you. You have to make out with them, something like that. When the Ebola, 3-4 years ago, when Ebola got bad, there was this band that made this song that went, Ebola, don't touch your friends, no kissing, touching. Because a lot of people were just having trouble with the idea that coming into contact with your infected friends or family members could give you Ebola. That's a direct contact transmission. Then there's ingestion. So you have to ingest the pathogen in order to actually get the disease. So it's not enough to breathe it in or to come into direct contact. You have to get that pathogen into your digestive system. So food poisonings are your gold star example of ingestion transmission. Then we have migration, specifically vertical migration. What does that mean? Vertical migration is when you transmit a pathogen from parent to child, right? If you see those pretty tulips, right, that have these cool little spots on them, right, pretty white spots all throughout them, that's actually a viral infection of the tulip. That tulip is infected with a virus to give it that pretty variegated colors. And the virus actually gets into the seed. So when the flower is fertilized and produces a seed, the virus migrates into the seed. One of the most common causes of blindness in the world is gonorrhea, right? So what happens is you have a gonorrheal infection of the vaginal tract, and during childbirth, when the baby passes through the vaginal tract, vaginal canal, it comes into contact with gonorrhea. Specifically, the eyes come into contact with gonorrhea, and you get gonorrheal blindness. So that is also vertical transmission from the parent to the child. So it could be, transmitting, as part of like the fetus. It might have managed to genetically transmit or get into the seed or the zygote or whatever, or you can transmit it during something like childbirth. But vertical migration, parent to child. So there we go. Okay, continuing on. Sexual transmission, right? So this is transmission via sexual contact or sexual fluids, right? So the vaginal fluids or the seminal fluids. So HIV is your classic sexually transmitted virus. It's transmitted via the sexual fluids. Something like herpes is transmitted just by contact, right? Herpes is cold sores that develop on the skin. And so when you have an active herpes infection, the cold sores are present on the skin, and someone comes into contact with an open cold sore, the herpes is spread via contact. Is just when we talk about genital herpes, all that literally means is that the cold sores are at the genitals. And so it's sexually transmitted in that generally when you're in contact with someone's genitals, it's sexual. But it's not transmitted by the actual fluids. HIV, transmitted via the fluids. All right, vehicular transmission. So vehicular transmission is a transmission on a non-living structure. For instance, in hospitals, UTIs are transmitted quite frequently because of the... hey, help me out. What's the tube? Catheters. Right? So catheters make an excellent an excellent vehicle for transmitting hospital UTIs. So a catheter is inserted into the urinary tract when someone is having surgery so that the urine can be directed into a collecting bag. So there are all sorts of mechanisms hospitals put in place to sterilize catheters, but UTIs in hospitals are big problems because they just make great vehicles for infection. So, then we have vectors, which are living transmission things. So, malaria, we talked about how they are transmitted by a mosquito vector, right? Well, rabies is generally transmitted by some kind of mammal vector. So common ones would be bats and canines. You can also get cats and various other things, but interestingly enough, not opossums. Opossums actually have a lower body temperature, and it's actually so low that rabies generally cannot survive in the opossum body. But things like bats, various types of canines, coyotes, foxes, some rodents, various just mammals are good vectors for rabies. Time for a little tangent, because rabies is cool. The rabies virus, I don't know if I should say cool, but it's really fascinating. So the rabies virus has sort of a two-stage thing. The first stage of the rabies infection is where it migrates to the brain, and it does some wacky stuff in the brain. Some of the basic things of it are fear of water. That's one of the hallmarks of a rabies virus infection in the brain, is developing a fear of water, right? You start to get shyness. You start to see a little bit of aggression. They're drinking less water, which means they're starting to salivate more, and eventually rabies viruses migrate from the brain to the salivary ducts, so that it's in the saliva. And at this point, they call the rabies virus, this phase of infection is called furious rabies. Furious rabies. This is good old-fashioned Cujo the dog, courtesy of Stephen King. The animal becomes incredibly aggressive and salivates an extreme amount in order to produce large amounts of virus in the saliva, and the aggression results in bites where it can transmit the rabies from the saliva into the blood. So rabies uses a mammal vector. Anyway, then there's sort of human error pathogen transmission through blood transfusions. So this can be very dangerous. In the early days of research into HIV, people got HIV from transfusions. So they didn't know to test blood for HIV because people were too busy being super weird and stupid about it, because it first became, I want to say, obvious in the gay populations in the 70s and 80s. A lot of gay men started getting HIV, so many such that they called it gay cancer. And once they had decided that it was a gay disease, like Ronald Reagan didn't direct the CDC to put effort into it kind of at all, which sucked, because it was allowed to go nuts, and not a lot of people were doing research into actually what it was. And so infected people gave blood, and people got HIV from transfusions. This has led to one of the most monumentally stupid policies there is, until I want to say 2012 or 13 maybe, the CDC had an outright ban on gay men donating blood. Gay men weren't allowed to donate blood. Doesn't matter if you don't have HIV. If you're gay, you can't donate blood. Just stupidest overreaction ever. Especially since there's great tests for it now, the 20-minute test. Anyway, in 2012 they lifted the ban on gay men donating HIV, and before you start to think that's progressive, if you're gay and male and want to donate blood, did I say donating HIV? Anyway, donating blood. If you're gay and male and want to donate blood, all you have to do is tell them that you've been abstinent, that you haven't had sex for an entire year. That's the requirement. If you're a gay man and you want to donate blood to help save someone's life, you have to have not had sex in an entire year. You can have the trashiest heterosexual people around just trading diseases, and as long as they're clean when they roll up into the donation clinic, go for it. But man, just soapbox over it. Okay, so droplets. Here's just some nice little pictures. We have droplets being transmitted between people, and that's direct contact, right? Then airborne, here is where the droplets are inside dust, so they're able to travel on the air. Vehicle transmission is where you have something non-living, so catheters at hospitals, maybe a phone your sick friend used and didn't tell you they hacked a loogie into, contaminated food, vector-borne transmission. Here's this poor kid being pestered by dots. I'm going to go with either mosquitoes or like some kind of fifth dimensional demon. I don't know.